Vera Malloy was 73 years old when her children sat her down and arranged her life for her. The house was going. The business was going. The savings account she had shared with Thomas for 41 years had been placed in what her son Dennis called a managed structure, which turned out to be a phrase that meant her name was no longer the only name on the documents. They had been thorough. They had spoken to attorneys and estate brokers and financial advisors for 3 months before they walked into her kitchen and opened the folder on the table. They had the numbers ready. They had the timeline ready. They believed, she could see, that they were doing the right thing. What they had not done was think about the warehouse. The building on Garfield Industrial Road had been hers for 22 years. A brick and steel structure from 1951, with high east-facing windows and a loading dock on the south end. She had bought it with money from her own catering business, finished the mortgage in 2018, and held it in a property trust her father had set up the day she signed the papers. The deed had her name on it, and only her name, and it had never entered a single conversation Dennis and Karen had with their attorneys. Neither of them had thought about it since the last time one of them called it an eyesore at a family dinner sometime around 2016. At the back of that warehouse was a room her father had sealed before he died. A padlocked door, a brass key on a worn leather tag with 2 words in his small, careful handwriting. Backroom. She had kept that key for 14 years without using it. She had not been ready. She was ready now. And what she found when she finally turned that lock would bring appraisers and archivists in a letter from a museum in Philadelphia to a building on a forgotten industrial road that her children had never once considered worth their time. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. Vera had been a practical woman for as long as she could remember. She kept receipts in labeled folders, one for each year going back to 1989. She paid her quarterly taxes 3 days before they were due, not on the due date, because her mother had taught her that waiting until the last moment was a form of hoping something would change, and hope was not a financial strategy. When her catering business was running at full capacity, she tracked every invoice and every supply order in a ledger she updated by hand every Friday evening at the kitchen table while Thomas watched the news from his chair in the next room. She had done that for 26 years. The chair was still there. Thomas had been gone for 8 months. The stroke had come on a Tuesday in November, fast, and without warning in the way strokes come, and by Thursday it was over. They had been married 41 years. She did not know how to be in the house without him. She moved through the rooms the way you move through a place after someone leaves, still half expecting to hear the particular sounds of his presence. The coffee maker starting before she got up. The creak of the 3rd stair when he came down in the night. The low sound of the news at 10 o'clock. The house held the shape of him for months after he was gone, and she let it. She was not ready to change anything. Not yet. Dennis called from Portland every Sunday. Karen called from Harrisburg on Tuesday evenings. The calls were warm and attended to and slightly wrong in the way that calls from adult children can be wrong, carrying beneath the warmth a steady, low-frequency monitoring. How are you sleeping? Are you eating properly? Have you talked to anyone, meaning a professional, about grief? The questions of people who love you and are also, in some part of themselves, beginning to calculate. She noticed the calculations. She was a woman who had run a catering business for 24 years, who had managed the finances of a household and a commercial operation simultaneously, who had negotiated contracts with venues and vendors and suppliers every year of her working life. She recognized the texture of people making decisions they had not yet announced. Dennis flew in from Portland on a Wednesday in March. He took a red-eye and arrived at the house on Dunmore Road with a rolling carry-on and the tight-jawed expression he had when he had made up his mind about something and was bracing for friction. Karen drove down from Harrisburg that same afternoon. They had dinner together the first night, the 3 of them around the same table where the 4 of them had eaten for 22 years before the children left. Vera made a pot roast because she still cooked properly when there were people at the table. Dennis had seconds. Karen poured the wine. Nobody said anything about the folder Karen had set on the kitchen counter when she came in. They said it the next morning. Dennis opened his laptop at the kitchen table, and Karen put the folder next to his coffee cup, and Vera sat across from both of them in Thomas's chair. Not her own. She had been sitting in Thomas's chair since November and couldn't stop, and she waited. Dennis was 47, broad-shouldered, a project manager at a software firm in Portland who wore his competence the way some people wore good shoes, visibly, as though it were something others might miss if he didn't signal it. Karen was 44, softer in manner though not always in intention, and she had the habit of managing difficult conversations by front-loading warmth, getting the warmth in early, so it was already on the table before the hard part came. The hard part came after the second cup of coffee. Thomas had left a will. It was not complicated. The house on Dunmore Road, the joint savings account, the stock portfolio his pension had built over 30 years, and the assets of Malloy. Electric supply, the small business he had run out of a commercial space on Birch Street. All of it to Vera, with specific bequests to the children for amounts Thomas had decided on privately and never discussed with her. Fine. His money to leave as he chose. The problem, Dennis explained, was the business. Malloy Electric had been running for 34 years on Thomas's relationships with contractors and Vera's bookkeeping. Without Thomas, the business was essentially a commercial lease, some inventory, and a name. Dennis had spoken to a business broker 3 weeks earlier. The clean solution was to close, liquidate the inventory, terminate the lease. He had spoken to an attorney. He and Karen had been working through this since January. The house, Karen said, carried a mortgage with 11 years remaining. On Social Security alone, Vera couldn't service it. The cleanest path was to sell, pay the balance, and distribute what remained. Vera's share would come to somewhere between $40,000 and $50,000, depending on the final price. Vera looked at the spreadsheet on Dennis's laptop. She looked at her son. "You've been planning this since January," she said. Dennis said they had been making sure they understood the situation before they brought it to her. He said it with the calm of a man who had rehearsed it enough times that it sounded reasonable. Karen put her hand on the table between them. She said that with the estate structured the way it was, the pension income would be held until probate cleared, and that everything Dennis was describing was the practical solution, the responsible one. She said the word responsible twice. Vera had lived in the house on Dunmore Road for 30 years. She had repainted every room herself. She knew which stair tread creaked, and which window stuck in August, and where the evening light fell on the kitchen floor in October. She knew where Thomas had buried their dog under the crabapple tree at the back corner of the yard, in the spring of 1998, when the girls next door had cried over the fence because they had loved that dog too. She sat with the spreadsheet in front of her and understood the shape of what her children had built while she was grieving. They had been careful. They had been thorough. They had consulted professionals. They had arrived at the cleanest outcome before sitting down with her, because they had not believed that consulting her first would change anything. She was a woman who was being managed by people who loved her, which was its own specific and quiet kind of loneliness. She asked for the folder. She spent 2 hours reading through it. She asked clarifying questions in the direct way she had always asked questions. She took notes in the small spiral notebook from the kitchen drawer. When she was done, she handed the folder back to Karen and said she needed a few days. Dennis said he understood. He also said the estate attorney had a timeline if they were going to take advantage of the spring market. He said it carefully, but he said it. That evening, after Dennis went to the guest room and Karen drove to her hotel, Vera sat alone at the kitchen table and opened the top drawer of the old sideboard along the east wall. Her father had built that piece in 1998 from a walnut tree that came down in a storm. The drawer held things without a clear category. A hospital bracelet from when Dennis was born. A photograph of her parents on their wedding day. A receipt from the catering company's first paid job, June 14, 1993, $12.50 per head, chicken and green beans, and a sheet cake. A retirement party for a man named Orville Sheets at the VFW Hall on Broad Street. And at the back of the drawer, in a small cotton drawstring bag, a brass key on a ring with a worn leather tag. Backroom. She had not held that key in 5 years. Possibly longer. She held it now, turned it once between her fingers, and set it on the table in front of her. The warehouse on Garfield Industrial Road had been hers for 22 years. She had bought it in 2002 when the catering business had grown large enough to need permanent storage, when she was tired of paying by the month for other people's space. The building was brick and steel from 1951, one story, 12,000 square feet, with a loading dock on the south end, and those east-facing windows her father had admired when he first walked through it with her. The price had been right. The bones were good. Her father had looked at the ceiling joists and the foundation walls and said, without drama, buy it. Emmett Stokes had been a man who worked with his hands his entire life, starting in his own father's furniture workshop in Allentown and eventually running his own studio, a quiet operation where he restored and occasionally built pieces for clients who knew what craft cost. He had come out of a tradition of working carefully and at length with things that most people didn't have patience for, pieces that were damaged or overlooked or too old-fashioned to interest anyone with money, that he could see past to what they actually were. He was not sentimental about objects in general. He was precise about which ones mattered. When Vera bought the warehouse, her father was 71 and still working. He had helped her set up the catering storage and had eventually claimed the back room as his own workshop, bringing his tools and his current projects and his quiet company on Saturday mornings. He worked there for 6 years before his health made it impractical. He died in October of 2009 at the age of 78, in the house where he had lived alone since Vera's mother passed in 1997. In the spring before he died, he had padlocked the back room of the warehouse and told her, sitting on her porch with a cup of tea and the directness he had when something mattered, that the key was in his Bible on the third shelf, and that she would know when the time was right to use it. She had found the key. After the funeral, she had put it in the cotton bag and put the bag in the sideboard drawer. Thomas had gotten his first diagnosis 6 months later, and then there had been 7 years of managing that, and a period of relative stability, and then a harder year, and then November. The back room had waited for 14 years on its shelf at the edge of her awareness. Patient the way locked things are patient when no one is pushing them. She put the key back in the bag and went to bed. In the morning, she called her friend Marguerite, who had been her closest friend for 30 years and who had the quality of listening to the full story before she said anything. Marguerite listened. When Vera finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Are you going to fight it?" Vera thought about it honestly. "No," she said. "The will says what it says, and they're not wrong about the mortgage. What I'm going to do is not be there when they sell the house." "Where are you going to go?" "The warehouse on Garfield Road." The silence on the other end had weight. Vera could hear Marguerite making her way through the obvious objections, running them in order. "It hasn't had anyone in it in 4 years," Marguerite said. "I know. There's no kitchen. There's no real bathroom. There's a utility sink and a toilet. That's enough to start." Another pause. "You want me to come with you? When you go out there the first time?" "Yes," Vera said. "I would like that." She told Dennis on the phone 2 days after they left. She said it plainly, that she had decided on the warehouse on Garfield Road, that she owned it outright, that she would be fine. Dennis was quiet for a moment with the careful quiet of a man recalculating. "Mom," he said, "you're talking about a commercial storage building. I own it outright. I finished the mortgage in 2018. I know you own it. But that's not," he paused, "that's not a place to live." She thanked him for his concern. She said she would be in touch. She hung up before he could find the right angle. She spent the next 2 weeks sorting through the house on Dunmore Road with the efficiency of a woman who had organized large events for paying clients and understood that sentiment and practicality were not enemies, but needed to be introduced properly. She kept what was hers by origin: her mother's china, her father's old workshop tools, a set of chisels in a leather roll, and a block plane she had been meaning to have sharpened for 20 years. 3 boxes of photographs, the walnut sideboard, the Friday ledger going back to 1989, Thomas's chair, his reading glasses from the table beside the chair, which she could not explain and did not try to. She let the estate company handle everything else. She did not cry in front of Dennis or Karen. She had cried on the drive back from the attorney's office, alone in the car, the ugly kind of crying that uses your whole body. And then she had pulled into a gas station parking lot and let it move through her, and then she had driven home. She did not want their comfort. She wanted her warehouse. The drive to Garfield Industrial Road on a gray Thursday in March took 40 minutes from Dunmore. Marguerite followed in her own car. They came through the downtown grid and out into the older industrial quarter where the streets widened and the buildings changed character, from storefront to warehouse, from residential to working. Garfield Road ran between a salvage yard and a plumbing supply company for 4 blocks before opening up into a row of mid-century commercial buildings, some maintained and some not. Vera's warehouse was 3/4 of the way down on the left, red brick on the front face and corrugated steel on the flanks, with a flat roof and the east-facing windows she had always liked for their light. The loading dock sat at the south end. The sign she had put up in 2003, Malloy Catering, was still there. The letters faded from red to the color of old brick dust. She had not been here in 4 years. She could see that in small ways. The gutters along the front face had accumulated 4 winters of debris and sagged slightly on the right corner. The strip of gravel along the base of the building had gone to weed. 2 of the high windows had clouded from within, a sign of condensation in the framing she would need to address. The loading dock door looked solid. The main entrance, a steel door with a lever handle, looked as it always had, because she had maintained the locks with graphite powder every 2 years the way her father taught her. 10 seconds of effort that meant you never stood outside your own building fighting a lock that had given up. She fit the key. It turned. The door swung inward. Storage and time. That was the smell. Concrete dust and old cardboard and the faint residue of the industrial cleaner she had used when she closed the catering operation in 2020 and cleaned the space properly before she locked it. The big overhead lights took 30 seconds to warm up, fluorescent tubes coming on in sequence from front to back, filling the space with their flat, even light. 12,000 square feet reads differently inside than it does on a property document. The ceiling was 18 feet at the center beam. The main floor was concrete, clean and uncracked through the center, with the wear marks along the loading dock end where years of carts had left their trace. Along the west wall, the steel shelving she had installed in 2004 still stood in 3 long runs, holding the last things she had stored here. Commercial chafing dishes in their cases. Folded linens in clear bags. The flat boxes containing the Italian ceramic serving platters she had used for large events. Hand-painted pieces she had bought at an estate sale in 1997 for a price she later understood to have been very low. Marguerite came in behind her and stood beside her looking the length of it. "It's in better condition than I expected," Marguerite said. "The bones are good," Vera said. She had known that. She had built it to stay good. You paid attention to a building the way you paid attention to anything worth keeping. She walked to the far end past the last run of shelving. At the back wall, to the right of the utility sink, was the door to the back room. Steel framed with a wooden core, the padlock through the hasp on the right side. Her father's lock, a heavy brass thing he had bought at a hardware store in 2008. The leather tag on the key ring was soft with age. The 2 words on it in her father's small, precise hand. She stood in front of it with the key in her hand. She did not open it that day. She stood there for a long moment, and then she put the key back in her coat pocket. She had the rest of the building to understand first. What needed doing, what could wait. Her father had kept that room sealed for 14 years without it going anywhere. It would keep for another week while she got the basics in order. She needed to be settled before she was ready for whatever he had left her. She needed to feel, again, like a woman who had started something rather than a woman who had just been removed from something. Marguerite read her correctly and said nothing about the door. They spent the next 2 hours walking the building with notebooks, the way Vera had always worked through a new situation, writing it down, making it real on paper. The roof was sound, no staining on the ceiling panels, no soft spots visible in the structural members. The electrical panel was legitimate and well-labeled, the work of a licensed contractor she had hired in 2007. The utility sink ran clear when she turned the tap and let it run for 3 minutes. The toilet in the small bathroom off the east wall flushed. The industrial water heater in the utility closet was cold and would need to be restarted, but Marguerite's nephew did electrical work and could come Wednesday. By Saturday, Vera had a cot in the northeast corner, partitioned from the rest of the space by 2 of the folding room dividers she had used at catering events, 6 feet of fabric panels that created something psychologically resembling a room. A space heater, a hot plate and a kettle and 2 pots and a small table. The walnut sideboard against the east wall where the morning light hit it. Thomas's chair facing the windows. The Friday ledger in the top drawer. She moved in on a Sunday. Dennis called that afternoon to ask if she was comfortable. She said she was working on it. He had 3 listings in a retirement community outside Pittsburgh if she changed her mind. She thanked him and said she would let him know. She did not change her mind. Every morning she made tea on the hot plate and sat in Thomas's chair with the east light coming through the high windows and looked at the cotton bag on top of the sideboard. The key inside it. The back room at the far end of the building, locked and waiting, holding whatever her father had decided 14 years ago that she would one day be ready to receive. She was almost ready. She needed a few more days of feeling like herself again. like the woman who had run a business and raised children and paid off a building with her own money and made something, before she walked to that door and put the key in the lock. Her father had said she would know when the time was right. She was beginning to know. She opened the back room on a Wednesday morning, 10 days after she moved in. Not because she had planned Wednesday specifically. She woke before 6 with the particular alertness that comes when you have been waiting for something long enough that your body decides to stop waiting for you. The east light was already coming through the high windows, the flat pale kind that precedes the actual sun by 20 minutes. And Vera lay on the cot for a moment looking up at the ceiling joists and listening to the building settle around her. A truck moved down Garfield Road. Somewhere on the salvage yard side, a forklift started and ran for a moment and stopped. She got up and made tea. She stood at the east windows with the cup in both hands and watched the light change. Then she put the cup down, took the cotton bag from the top of the sideboard, and walked to the back of the warehouse. The padlock was cold in the morning air. The key fit without resistance. She had expected difficulty, 14 years of disuse, metal that had forgotten what it was for, but the mechanism turned cleanly, and she understood then that her father had maintained it before he sealed the room, had made sure it would open without a fight when the time came, because he was a man who thought about what happened after him. She lifted the lock free of the hasp and pushed the door open. The smell reached her before she could see anything. Cedar and linseed oil and the particular dry sweetness of old wood shavings. Underneath that something older and harder to name, the smell of objects that have been sealed in one place for a long time. Not decay. Nothing had rotted in here. The smell was preservation, airtight and specific, like opening a drawer that had been closed since another decade. She found the light switch just inside the door on the left, where her father had always put light switches because he believed they belonged in the same place in every room. A single overhead fluorescent buzzed and caught and threw its light across the space. The room was smaller than the main floor of the warehouse, but larger than she remembered, perhaps 20 by 30 feet, with the same concrete floor and the same high ceiling. Her father's workbench ran along the left wall, a solid piece he had built himself from Douglas fir, the surface worn smooth in the places where he had worked most often. His tools were still laid out. That stopped her. She had expected them to be stored, put away the way you put things away when you're preparing a space to be sealed. But the tools were laid out as though he had stepped away from a job and would be back in an hour. 3 chisels arranged by width. A smoothing plane at the near corner of the bench. A mallet, a marking gauge, a set of carving gouges in their canvas roll, unrolled and open. A piece of fine sandpaper folded once and left on the bench surface, the fold still crisp. She stood in the doorway looking at the bench for a long time. Along the right wall, floor to ceiling, her father had built shelving from the same Douglas fir. Every shelf was full, not stacked carelessly. Everything was placed with the deliberate care of a man who thought about how weight distributed and how air moved around objects. She stepped into the room and began to look. The first thing she recognized was a painted box on the second shelf from the top, about 18 inches long and 12 deep. She had seen it before, decades ago, sitting on her father's workbench in his studio in Allentown, and had always thought of it as just one of the things he worked on, the rotating inventory of old pieces that passed through his hands. The background was a deep barn red that had gone warm and dark with age, and across the front panel, painted in the Pennsylvania German decorative style her father had spent his life studying, were 2 confronted birds facing a central urn, their tail feathers sweeping out in long arcs, the colors still vivid despite however many years the box had been sitting on this shelf. Green and yellow and a white that had aged to ivory. Hinges of hand-wrought iron, slightly irregular in the way hand-forged iron was always slightly irregular. She touched the edge of it carefully with one finger. She moved along the shelf slowly. More painted pieces. A smaller box with a heart motif on the lid. The paint surface fine crazed from age in the pattern of very old work. A set of carved wooden figures, 8 of them, ranging from perhaps 4 inches to nearly a foot tall. Folk pieces in the tradition of Pennsylvania German carving. Each face distinct, each pose different. The wood beneath the surface paint a deep honey color where it had been exposed at the edges by handling over many years of unknown handling before they came to her father. A large stoneware crock with a cobalt blue decoration of a running deer on one side and a flowering vine on the other, the glaze still intact, The saltfire surface textured the way only old stoneware was textured. On the third shelf, wrapped in acid-free tissue paper that her father had clearly purchased specifically for the purpose, a set of pieces she had to unwrap carefully before she understood what she was looking at. Fraktur documents. She knew the word from her father. Illuminated manuscripts, Pennsylvania German tradition, the decorative writing art that had flourished in the isolated communities of southeastern Pennsylvania from the late 1700s through the mid-1800s. Birth records, house blessings, marriage documents, religious texts, each one lettered by hand in the ornate fractured script the tradition was named for, each one bordered by painted birds and flowers and the repeating geometric motifs of the tradition. 6 of them, each in its own wrapping, each one intact. She set the last one down carefully and looked at the shelves around her and understood that she was standing in the middle of something her father had spent decades building, piece by piece, at farm auctions and estate sales and private sales from families who didn't know what they had or didn't want to know, because knowing would have complicated the story of what they were selling for whatever the auction would bring that day. At the far end of the workbench, weighted down by a small block of walnut, was an envelope, her name on the front, in her father's hand. She sat on the stool beside the bench and opened it. 3 pages, written in the same small, precise script he had used his whole life. He had dated it April of 2009, 6 months before he died. He began without preamble. He was not a man who believed in preamble. He wrote that he had been collecting these pieces for 40 years, that it had begun in 1969 at an estate auction outside Kutztown, when a painted blanket chest went for $11 because nobody in the room knew what they were looking at, and he did. He had been 29 years old. He had bought the chest and carried it home in the back of his truck and spent 3 weeks restoring it to what it had been before someone painted over it in the 1940s. And when he was done, he had a piece that he understood, with the certainty of a man who had spent his working life inside the tradition. Was a significant example of decorated Pennsylvania German furniture from the first quarter of the 19th century. He did not sell it. He added it to a shelf in his studio and kept buying. He wrote that he had never told anyone the full extent of what he had gathered because he had not found the right moment, and because he was not certain the moment would come in his own lifetime. He wrote that he had been watching what had happened to this material in the wider world, how slowly the scholarly attention had shifted toward it, how the major collections had been assembled by institutions with money and time, and how much was still out there in private hands, in attics and barns and estate sales, being sold for nothing by people who knew the pieces were old, but not what old meant in this context. He wrote that the collection he was leaving her contained, by his own careful accounting, 112 pieces. He listed categories: painted furniture, including 7 blanket chests and 11 smaller boxes of various types; carved figures, 23 pieces; stoneware, 14 pieces; Fraktur documents, 19 pieces; textiles, including 11 examples of decorated needlework and 4 hooked rugs; assorted smaller objects, the category he called everything else. He wrote that he had done his best to research and document each piece, and that the documentation was in the 2 archival boxes on the bottom shelf. Under the workbench, 1 box of notes and the other of photographs, because he had understood long before the age of digital records that a photograph and a handwritten note in an archival box would outlast most other forms of documentation. He wrote that he was leaving this to her, and not to anyone else, because she was the one who had always known the difference between the price of something and the value of it. The last paragraph was 3 sentences. He wrote that he had loved his work his entire life, and that the work had been, in the end, the patient gathering of things that deserved to be gathered, and that she should take her time with what she did next, and not let anyone rush her, and not sell anything to the first person who made an offer. He wrote that she would know who to trust when she found them. She sat on the stool with the letter in both hands for a long time. The overhead light ticked in the quiet. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. She could hear Garfield Road picking up its ordinary pace, trucks and the forklift on the salvage yard side, and someone's radio in the plumbing supply lot. She folded the letter along its original creases and put it back in the envelope, and sat with the envelope in her lap, and let herself feel the full weight of what her father had done. Not the financial weight, the other kind. He had spent 40 years of his working life gathering these things because he believed they deserved to survive and be known, and he had sealed them in a room and left the key in his Bible and trusted her to open it when she was ready. He had not trusted Dennis. He had not trusted Karen, whom he had loved as a grandfather loved his grandchildren, fully and specifically. He had trusted Vera, because she was the one who had always known the difference between the price of something and the value of it. She pressed the envelope flat against her chest for a moment. Then she stood up and went back into the main floor of the warehouse to make a second cup of tea and call Marguerite. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. Marguerite answered on the second ring and listened without interrupting in the way she always listened. And when Vera finished describing what was in the room and reading the last paragraph of the letter aloud, Marguerite was quiet for a moment and then said, "Vera, I think you need to talk to Helen Marsh." Helen Marsh had retired 4 years earlier from the Regional History Museum in Harrisburg, where she had spent 26 years as a curator with a specialty in Pennsylvania material culture. She was 67, slight and precise, with short gray hair and reading glasses on a chain and the manner of someone who had spent decades moving through rooms full of objects and had developed a way of seeing things that was neither casual nor excitable, but simply, rigorously attentive. Marguerite had known her for 15 years through a women's historical society they both belonged to. Helen came on a Friday. She arrived in a sensible hatchback with a canvas bag, a camera, a box of cotton gloves, and an archival reference book she carried under her arm the way academics carry books, as though it were part of her person rather than something she was carrying. She shook Vera's hand at the door with a firm grip and looked at the warehouse main floor with the practiced neutrality of someone who had learned not to react before she saw what she came to see. Vera took her to the back room. Helen stopped in the doorway. She stood there for a moment without speaking, her eyes moving across the shelves. Then she put on a pair of cotton gloves, opened her canvas bag, and took out the camera. She spent 4 hours in the room. Vera left her alone for the first 2, going to make tea and read through her father's documentation notebooks, which she had pulled from the archival box under the bench. 40 years of meticulous notes in her father's handwriting, acquisition dates, prices paid, provenance research, condition assessments, the careful record of a man who understood that the story of where an object had been was part of what the object was. When she went back, Helen was sitting on the stool with the Fraktur documents laid out on the workbench, examining them with a small magnifying glass. She looked up when Vera came in. She said, "Your father knew exactly what he was doing." Vera sat on a folding chair she had brought in from the main floor. "I know," she said. Helen set down the magnifying glass and looked at the shelves behind her with an expression Vera had been watching develop over the past 2 hours, something that had started as careful professional attention and had moved, steadily, towards something she recognized as controlled excitement. "I want to be precise with you," Helen said. "I'm a curator and an appraiser, not an auction house, and I don't deal in specific valuations without proper process. What I can tell you right now, from what I'm seeing, is that your father assembled a collection of Pennsylvania German folk art that is, by any measure I'm aware of, museum caliber." Vera looked at the painted box she had noticed first on the second shelf. The confronted birds on the barn-red ground. Helen followed her gaze. "That piece alone," she said carefully, "that painted dower chest, if it is what I believe it to be, which I won't confirm without additional research, but if it is, that piece belongs in a conversation about the finest surviving examples of decorated Pennsylvania German furniture from the first half of the 19th century. How many of the 112 pieces are you saying that about?" Helen considered her answer for a moment. "I haven't examined everything." She looked at the shelves. "But from what I've seen, quite a few." Vera opened her father's documentation notebook to the entry for the painted box and showed it to Helen. Helen read it slowly, then read it again. She looked up at Vera. "You researched this. All of this." 40 years of research, Vera said. "The documentation is in 2 archival boxes." Helen looked at the boxes under the bench. She looked at the shelves. She looked at Vera. "Who else knows about this room?" "No one," Vera said. "My father sealed it before he died. I just opened it this week." Helen sat with that for a moment. Then she said, "We need to get proper appraisers in here. From one of the major auction houses with a folk art department, Christie's or Sotheby's both have specialists, or there's a firm in Philadelphia that handles Pennsylvania material specifically that I would recommend for this collection." We also need to get the documentation into proper archival condition before anything is moved. Vera looked at the letter in her hand, the last paragraph, her father's 3 sentences. Not sell anything to the first person who made an offer. She would know who to trust when she found them. She had found them faster than she expected. She said, "Tell me about the Philadelphia firm." Helen knew the firm well enough to call a contact there directly. She made the call from the warehouse that afternoon, standing in the main floor with her phone, talking in the clipped, efficient way of someone who had spent years navigating institutional relationships and knew how to convey urgency without overstating. Vera heard the word significant twice in collection of this scope once, and then Helen came back and said that a specialist named James Okafor would come the following Wednesday, if Vera was willing, and that he would bring a colleague who worked specifically with Fraktur and Pennsylvania German paper arts. James Okafor arrived Wednesday in a dark coat and good shoes that were wrong for a warehouse floor, but which he didn't mention. He was in his mid-50s, Nigerian-American, with a deliberate way of moving through a room and the kind of attention that made objects feel properly regarded. His colleague, a woman named Dr. Wren Bauer from the folk art program at the University of Pennsylvania, carried 2 bags of equipment and handled the Fraktur documents with the particular reverence of someone who had spent decades working with material that was one careless move from being lost forever. They spent the full day. Vera and Helen stayed mostly in the main floor, going in when asked, answering questions about the documentation notebooks and her father's acquisition records. James came out twice to ask specific questions. The first time he wanted to know whether any of the pieces had ever been exhibited or loaned to an institution. The answer was no. The second time, near the end of the afternoon, he came out and stood in the main floor for a moment with his hands in his coat pockets, and Vera recognized the posture of a man who was choosing his words. He said that he had been working in American folk art appraisal for 21 years. He said that collections of this size and this quality came to his attention perhaps once a decade, if that, and that when they did, they were almost never this intact and almost never this well documented. Vera was sitting in Thomas's chair with her father's notebook in her lap. She looked at James across the concrete floor. "What does that mean in terms of what happens next?" she asked. He said that proper appraisal would take several weeks, that he would need to research provenance on specific pieces, that the documentation her father had assembled would significantly accelerate that process. He said he could give her no specific numbers today, but that she should understand she was sitting in the same building as a collection that would be of serious interest to every major American folk art institution in the country. Dr. Bauer came out of the back room and stood in the doorway. She said, "The Fraktur. One of them, the one your father dated to approximately 1790, if that dating is supported by the pigment and paper analysis, which I believe it will be, is a piece I have never seen documented anywhere. Not in any collection I am aware of." Vera looked at her. Dr. Bauer said it carefully because she was an academic and academics are careful, but her voice had something in it that was not academic. There are perhaps 30 documented examples of Fraktur from the period before 1800, she said. If this is what it appears to be, it is a piece of real historical significance for the study of Pennsylvania German decorative arts. Vera thought about a Tuesday auction outside Kutztown in 1969. A young man of 29 with a truck and 40 years of what came after. She thought about the things that pass through the world being sold for nothing, because no one in the room knows what to look for. Her father had known. He had spent his whole life knowing, and he had quietly gathered the things that were about to disappear, and he had sealed them in a room in her building and written her 3 sentences at the end of a letter. She would know who to trust when she found them. Helen put a hand on Vera's shoulder briefly. It was not a dramatic gesture, just a hand on the shoulder of a woman who had needed someone to stand beside her. James said he would have a preliminary report within 3 weeks and formal appraisals within 60 days. He left his card and shook her hand and said that if she had questions in the meantime, she should call him directly. He said that once the appraisals were formalized and the scope of the collection was fully understood, there would be decisions to make, and that he would help her navigate them without pressure. She thanked him. She thanked Dr. Bauer. She watched their car pull out onto Garfield Road and turn toward the highway. Then she went back into the back room and sat on the stool at her father's workbench and looked at the tools he had left laid out. The 3 chisels arranged by width, the smoothing plane at the corner, the mallet and the marking gauge, and the carving gouges in their canvas roll. The piece of fine sandpaper folded once, the fold still crisp after 14 years in a sealed room. She picked up the smallest chisel. It was properly sharpened. Of course it was. He had sharpened his tools before he sealed the room the same way she had maintained the lock, because you prepared things for whoever came next. She turned the chisel in her hands, feeling the balance of it, the weight that was exactly right, a tool made for a specific purpose by someone who had thought about that purpose. She set it back in its place on the bench. She picked up her father's documentation notebook and read through 20 pages of it in the quiet of the sealed room that was sealed no longer, his careful hand moving through decades of acquisition and research and patient accumulation. The handwriting steady even in the years when she knew his hands had given him trouble, steady because he had been determined that the record would be legible for whoever came next. She was whoever came next. She was ready to find out what that meant. James Okafor's preliminary report arrived by email on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after his visit, in a PDF attachment with a cover note that said he would be available to talk through the findings at whatever time suited her. Vera read the email at the small table beside the east windows, in the morning light that had become her preferred reading light over the past month, and then she opened the attachment and read it twice before she called him. The report ran to 14 pages. It was precise and careful and written in the language of professional appraisal, which meant it said nothing without qualification and everything with documentation. Vera read it the way she had always read financial documents, with a pen in her hand and a notebook open beside her, marking the passages that required follow-up questions and the numbers she wanted to understand in full context. The numbers were significant. James had completed preliminary research on 37 of the 112 pieces. The pre-1800 fracture that Dr. Bauer had flagged on the first visit had been analyzed for pigment composition and paper fiber, the results consistent with late 18th century production, and had been cross-referenced against every major collection and published catalog raisonné of Pennsylvania German fracture work. It did not appear in any of them. James wrote that in his professional opinion the piece was a previously undocumented example of fracture art from approximately 1785 to 1795, and that based on comparable sales at major auction houses over the past decade, a conservative estimate of its individual value at formal appraisal would be in the range of $160,000 to $210,000. Vera set her pen down for a moment. She picked it up and kept reading. The painted dower chest with the confronted birds, the first piece she had recognized, had been provisionally dated to between 1815 and 1830, identified by its decorative motifs and construction details as the work of a specific regional decorating tradition centered in Berks County, Pennsylvania. Several chests attributed to the same regional tradition had sold in the past 15 years, the most recent at Christie's for $380,000. Her father's chest was, in James's assessment, comparable in quality and superior in condition to that example. She sat with that number for a while. By the time she called James, she had read the report 3 times and filled 4 pages of her notebook. He answered immediately, as though he had been expecting her call, which she supposed he had. He walked her through the findings with the patience of someone who understood that 14 pages of appraisal language required translation for a person encountering it for the first time, even a precise and financially literate person. He said that the full formal appraisal of all 112 pieces would take the remaining 40 days he had estimated, and that his preliminary assessment of the collection's total value, based on the 37 pieces examined, suggested a range of between $1.8 and $2.4 million for the collection as a whole. He said that number would almost certainly move upward as the remaining pieces were researched, given what the first 37 had yielded. Vera looked out the east windows at the flat industrial sky above Garfield Road. She asked him what the options were. Not just the financial options, all of them. He said there were 3 broad paths. She could sell the collection through auction, either in parts or in its entirety, and realize the maximum financial return. She could donate the collection or significant portions of it to an institution, which would carry tax implications that her accountant should assess, and would ensure the pieces remained accessible to scholars and the public. Or she could pursue a combination, donating the most historically significant pieces and selling the remainder, which in his experience produced both the strongest financial outcome for his clients and the outcome they most often felt was right. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, Your father spent 40 years building this collection. I think he had a view about what should happen to it. His documentation suggests a man who cared about the pieces being known and studied, not just preserved. Vera thought about the letter on the workbench. The 40 years beginning at an auction in Kutztown in 1969. The patient gathering of things that deserve to be gathered. She said, "Tell me which institutions would be the right home for the Fraktur piece and the most important chests." He told her. There were 3 he would recommend. The Philadelphia Museum of Art, which had a significant Pennsylvania German collection, the American Folk Art Museum in New York, and the Pennsylvania German Cultural Heritage Center at Kutztown University, which was geographically and historically the most specific fit for this body of material. Vera said she would think about it and call him by the end of the week. She called Helen Marsh that evening. Helen had been in contact since the first visit, checking in, answering questions, helping Vera understand the institutional landscape without steering her in any particular direction. Vera told her what the preliminary report said. Helen was quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she said, "Your father knew." "I know," Vera said. Helen said she had a contact at the Kutztown Center she trusted completely, a director named Margaret Sohl, who had spent her career making the case that Pennsylvania German folk art deserved the same serious institutional attention as any other American artistic tradition. She said if Vera was open to it, she would make an introduction. Margaret Sohl came on a Thursday, a tall woman in her early 60s with the easy confidence of someone used to walking into rooms full of objects and knowing what she was seeing. She spent 2 hours in the back room and came out with the expression of someone who had been hoping for something for a long time and had just found it. She and Vera sat at the small table by the east windows and talked for an hour about what a formal partnership between the collection and the center would look like, about what Vera's father had documented, about what proper exhibition and study of this material would mean for the field. Margaret said the center would want to pursue acquisition of the most historically significant pieces, subject to full appraisal. She said the Fraktur collection and at least 3 of the painted chests were the pieces she would most want to discuss. She did not make an offer that afternoon. She said the process required proper appraisal completion and institutional review, and that she wanted to be honest with Vera that the center's acquisition budget was not unlimited, but that there were grant mechanisms available for material of this historical significance that could supplement what the center could offer directly. She said one other thing before she left. She said that the documentation Vera's father had assembled was, in her experience, extraordinarily rare for a private collection of this age and scope, and that it would significantly strengthen the case she could make to her board and to granting bodies for the acquisition. She said it was the kind of documentation that only happened when someone spent decades caring about the material for reasons beyond its financial value. Vera walked her to the door and shook her hand and watched her drive away down Garfield Road. Then she went back to the bench in the back room and sat on the stool and looked at her father's tools laid out in their places, the 3 chisels, the smoothing plane, the mallet, and she thought that he had known for 40 years, that the right person would come, that the right institution would come, and that the pieces he had gathered would eventually be in a room where people understood what they were looking at. He had just needed someone to open the door first. The formal appraisal was completed 53 days after James's first visit. The final number for the full collection was $2,240,000. James called her with it on a Monday morning and read it with the measured delivery of a man who had delivered significant numbers before and understood that the response required space. Vera sat with it. Then she thanked him and said she was ready to move forward. The partnership with the Kutztown Center was formalized over the following month. Vera donated the pre-1800 Fraktur and 5 others from the collection outright, along with 2 of the painted chests, including the confronted birds piece her father had bought in 1969 for $11, and the full documentation archive. The center's acquisition grant covered the appraised value of the donated pieces, which went directly to Vera, and the center committed to a formal exhibition of the material within 18 months and a published catalog with full scholarly documentation. Her father's name, Emmett Stokes, would appear in the catalog as the collector responsible for preserving the pieces. The remaining pieces were handled through James's firm over the following 3 months, some placed with private collectors through private sale, others through auction. Vera was not in a hurry. She followed her father's instruction exactly. She did not sell anything to the first person who made an offer. By the time the process was complete, she had cleared every financial concern she would ever need to address for the rest of her life, with enough remaining to do what she had been quietly thinking about since the morning she first opened the backroom door. Margaret Soule issued a press release when the donation was formalized. It was a single page, institutional and dry in the way press releases were, describing the acquisition of a previously unknown collection of Pennsylvania German folk art assembled over 4 decades by a private collector, donated to the center by his daughter. The regional newspaper in Harrisburg picked it up and called Vera. She agreed to speak to them, briefly, about her father. The story ran on a Saturday. Dennis called on Sunday morning. She saw his name on the screen and answered on the third ring. He said he had seen the piece in the paper. He said it slowly and without his usual forward momentum, the measured pace of a man who was understanding something as he spoke rather than having understood it before he dialed. Vera waited. He said he didn't know about the collection. He said he'd had no idea what was in the warehouse. He said he and Karen had talked about it the night before, after they both read the article. He said they had not known. Vera said, "I know you didn't." He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Mom, I'm sorry. Not just about this. About how we handled everything after Dad died. About the timeline. About the way we sat you down. I've been sorry about that for a while. I didn't know how to say it." It had the sound of something he had been working up to for months. The careful construction of a man who had thought about what he wanted to say and had found, when he finally said it, that the words were simpler than he had expected them to be. Vera looked at the east windows, the morning light coming across the warehouse floor to where she sat in Thomas's chair. She thought about the folder on the kitchen table in March. The word responsible said twice. The estate attorney's timeline. She said, "You moved faster than you should have. I think you knew that even then." He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm not going to keep that conversation in a place where it poisons everything else. But I need you to have understood it, not just regretted the outcome." He said he had understood it. He said the understanding had not been comfortable. She gave him credit for that. It was the right response, not the one that made things easier for him, but the one that was honest. She said they were welcome to come and see the place. She said call first. Dennis and Karen came on a Saturday. 2 weeks later, the same gray late autumn sky that had been over Garfield Road the day Vera arrived. They pulled into the lot in Dennis's car and got out and stood looking at the warehouse front, the brick face and the faded Malloy catering sign and the east windows with their morning light. Vera opened the door before they reached it. She had not staged anything for their benefit. The warehouse was as it was, Thomas's chair by the windows, the walnut sideboard along the east wall, the Friday ledger in the drawer, the hot plate and the kettle, and the 2 mismatched mugs on the small table. The folding room dividers that had served as her bedroom partition since March still in place because she had grown accustomed to the arrangement and saw no reason to change it. Dennis looked at all of it and said nothing for a moment. Karen stood beside him with her hands in her coat pockets. Vera made tea on the hot plate, and they sat at the small table. She showed them through the back room. She stood in the doorway and watched them look at the shelves, at the pieces still remaining that had not yet been placed, at the workbench with her father's tools, at the archival boxes on the bottom shelf, the 40 years of documentation in her father's careful hand. Karen picked up one of the smaller carved figures from the shelf, with permission, handling it carefully the way people handle things they understand to be old and significant. She turned it over, looked at the base, looked at the face. She set it back where it belonged. She said, "Grandpa kept all of this here. He kept it here for 22 years, Vera said. He sealed the room when he knew he was dying and left me the key." Karen looked at the workbench, at the tools laid out as though someone had stepped away. "Did he tell you what was in here?" she asked. "Not specifically," Vera said. "He trusted me to find out when I was ready." The silence that followed was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who were thinking, actually thinking, about the person who had stood in this room for 6 years on Saturday mornings building something that only made sense now, looking back. Dennis stood at the workbench with his hands at his sides. He looked older in this room than he had at the kitchen table in March. Not in a bad way. In the way people look when they have stopped performing competence and are simply present. He said, "We didn't ask you about this place. Not once in all of it." "No," Vera said. "We were looking at the mortgage and the business and the estate timeline. and we never thought about what else there might be that you had built on your own. That's right. He turned from the bench and looked at her. He said it plainly, without softening it for his own comfort. We treated you like a problem to be organized rather than a person to be consulted. And we were wrong. Karen said quietly, I'm sorry, Mom. Vera looked at her daughter. This woman she had raised and loved, and continued to love in the complicated way you love people who have disappointed you without stopping to be your children. She said, I know you are. She said it without coldness. She meant it. They stayed for 2 hours. She showed them the documentation notebooks, let them read some of her father's entries, the careful accounting of a life's work. She told them about Helen and Margaret and James and the process of the past months. She told them about the exhibition at the Kutztown Center, which was scheduled for the following spring and at which she had been asked to speak. She told them about what the catalog would say about her father. Dennis asked if he could come to the exhibition. She said of course. When they left, Karen hugged her at the door and held on longer than usual. Dennis shook her hand, which was not a thing he normally did with his mother, and she understood it as the gesture of a man marking a moment, acknowledging that something had shifted between them that deserved to be acknowledged. She watched their car pull out onto Garfield Road and turn toward the highway. Then she went back inside and poured the last of the tea and stood at the east windows and let herself feel the full quiet of the Saturday afternoon. She had not needed them to come. She had not needed their apology to have built what she had built. The collection was documented and partly donated and the rest properly placed, and her father's name was going into a published catalog, and she had secured her own life on her own terms with money from objects her son had never once considered worth thinking about. None of that required their acknowledgement. But she was glad they had come. She was glad Dennis had said what he said in the back room. Not because it changed anything that had happened, but because she did not want to spend the rest of her life with the distance between them calcifying into something permanent. She was 73 years old. She had lost Thomas. She was not going to lose her children too if the alternative was available. The alternative, it turned out, was available. It required honesty and time and the willingness to let people reckon with themselves rather than rushing to smooth it over. She had waited. They had reckoned. They would keep building from there, slowly, at the pace that honest repair required. Marguerite came the following Saturday with a pot of soup and the news that she had been telling everyone she knew about the Kutztown exhibition. She set the soup on the hot plate and sat across from Vera and said that Ruth Calder from the Historical Society wanted to organize a group visit to the spring opening, and that she had already said yes on Vera's behalf, which she acknowledged was presumptuous but also correct. Vera said it was correct. Marguerite looked around the warehouse, at the chair and the sideboard and the Friday ledger and the backroom door standing open at the far end. She said, You know you could get a proper apartment now. Or a house. Vera looked at the east windows. The afternoon light was doing the thing it did in November, going gold and flat across the concrete floor, reaching all the way to the walnut sideboard where the morning light hit it. She said, I'm staying here. Marguerite looked at her. Because of the building? Because of what I built in it, Vera said. There's a difference. She had come here in March with 2 suitcases and a cotton bag containing a key she had held for 14 years. She had come here because her children had organized her life for her and left her the one thing they had never thought about, and she had driven to it on a gray Thursday morning and opened the door and begun. She had started alone on a concrete floor with a cot and a space heater and a hot plate and the particular stripped-down clarity of a woman who had nothing left to perform for anyone. She had opened a room her father sealed in faith and found 40 years of his most careful work waiting for exactly this moment. She had found the people who knew what the work meant and trusted them with it, the way her father had trusted her, and the work was going into the world now, into a catalog and an exhibition and the permanent collections of an institution that would study it long after everyone in this room was gone. And her father's name was in the catalog. That was not nothing. That was not nearly nothing. That was a man's life's work, the patient gathering of things that deserved to be gathered, coming finally into the light after 14 years in a sealed room because his daughter had driven to a building on a forgotten industrial road when she had nowhere else to go, and opened the door and stayed. The world had a way of deciding when people were finished. It made that decision early and with confidence, and it dressed the decision in the language of practicality and care and what was reasonable for a woman of her age. Vera had heard that language at her own kitchen table and she had driven away from it toward a brass key in a cotton bag in a building with good bones and an east wall full of morning light. She had not been finished. She had barely started. She was 73 years old, and she had her father's tools on a workbench and a collection in a catalog and a life that was entirely, specifically, irreversibly hers. The backroom door at the far end of the warehouse stood open. It was not going to be sealed again. The exhibition opened on a Thursday in late April, in a gallery that smelled like fresh paint and climate-controlled air and the particular quiet of a room prepared to receive visitors. Margaret Soule had sent photographs during the installation, pictures of the confronted bird's chest in its case, the fraktur pieces under conservation lighting, the carved figures on stepped platforms arranged with the care of objects that had waited a long time to be properly seen. Vera had studied the photographs without quite being ready for the room itself. She arrived an hour before the public opening with Marguerite beside her. The placard beside the confronted bird's chest read, "Painted Dower Chest, Berks County, Pennsylvania, circa 1815 to 1830. From the collection of Emmett Stokes, assembled 1969 to 2009. Donated by Vera Malloy, 2024. She stood in front of it for a long time. Margaret found her there and said that the catalog had drawn requests from 4 university libraries and 2 additional museum collections wanting copies for their reference shelves. 2 graduate students had already contacted the center asking to work with the full documentation archive for their dissertations. The fraktur piece had been independently reviewed by 3 scholars in the field, all of whom confirmed her father's dating. Margaret said, "He was right about all of it." "I know," Vera said. "He usually was." Dennis and Karen arrived 20 minutes before the public doors opened. Dennis in a suit slightly too formal for the occasion. Karen with the expression of someone who had been thinking about this room for weeks. They stood in front of the chest and read the placard. Karen read it twice. Dennis stood with his hands at his sides and said nothing. Vera watched from across the room without making it obvious. She had not told them what to expect. She had said come and see, and they had come. Marguerite's Historical Society group arrived in a cluster of 14, moving through the gallery with the attentive pleasure of people who had been waiting for something like this to exist. Ruth Calder stood in front of the fraktur case for a full 5 minutes. An older man Vera didn't recognize pressed close to the glass of the carved figures, then straightened up and said to no one in particular, "My grandmother had one of these." He said it with the tone of someone placing a lost thing back inside a larger story it had always belonged to. That was the moment Vera understood again what her father had been doing all those years. Not building a collection for its financial or scholarly value alone, though it had both. Building a record, keeping a thread alive long enough for the people it belonged to, or who belonged to it, to find their way back. She spoke for 7 minutes when Margaret introduced her to the room. She had notes, but didn't use them. She talked about her father, about the auction outside Kutztown in 1969, about the Saturday mornings she remembered from childhood when he disappeared into his studio and came out quieter and more himself than at any other time of the week. She talked about the key on the leather tag. She did not talk about the folder on the kitchen table or the house on Dunmore Road. That was not this story. This story was her father and the things he believed were worth keeping and the 40 years he had spent proving it. When she finished, the room held its quiet for a moment before people moved again. Dennis came to her side. He put his hand briefly on her shoulder without saying anything. She let him. She drove back to Garfield Road in the early evening light, the windows down, the April air still cold enough to feel against her face. She let herself in through the steel door and turned on the overhead lights and stood for a moment in the center of the warehouse floor, in the space she had made into a life since March, and was quiet. Then she went to the back room, sat on the stool at her father's bench, took one of the carving gouges from the canvas roll, and picked up a small block of walnut she had set aside 3 weeks ago. Not to restore something someone else had made, to begin something of her own. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.